I don't know why the audio does that. And there's no way to fix it. The file on my computer goes completely screwed, and then I upload it, and I have no way. And it's funny, too, because I've done what? That was my fourth video of the day. There was nothing that happened to my computer between the third and fourth video to cause the audio to go completely messy. I've had multiple microphones that's happened with, and more than one computer that's happened with. So I bewildered. Just at some point, my computer decides to flip me off, and I upload the results to the internet, and then everything all goes kerflooey. Now, I'm not going to redo the exact same thing I just did because I can't. There's people who've already gone to the end, likely of that video, and gone, hey, what's going on here? Because people just skip to the end. So, I got to do it all over again. All right. Now, the panic index has been retired for a couple of months because we haven't had hockey. And so I want to take a look at next year's season and where the expectation is going to be. So this is both fan expectation and the expectation the media may throw on them as well. And there's some interesting results that come out of this. Trust me, there was interesting results at the end of the last one. Not that unless you're a lip reader. If you're a lip reader, you're fine. Yeah, but let's get through it. So we're going from yay hockey, which is your happy people that don't care about whether or not they win, to we need the Stanley Cup this year. And this is for next season. So this is not for 2020. This is for next season. So the yay hockey people who may very well be fine with their team not making the playoffs and understanding they may go through a retool or a rebuild, it's a very small number. Chicago. I have Chicago there because I think people realized Keith's not getting younger. Crawford's not getting younger. They traded off Leonard. And so the expectation is it's highly likely they are in the midst of a retool. I don't think it'll be a full-on rebuild because you've still got Kane and Taves young enough that they can maybe take a shot at it soon. But if they end up having a poor season, you have another year of Kirby Dach taking steps forward, and some of the young guys getting into the lineup, and then maybe you luck out this year's draft and next year's draft, then you can look at getting back into it after that. But that's why I have Chicago where I have them. Not that I haven't already explained this, but hey, that's how that works on the internet. Detroit, there's no pressure on Detroit to make the playoffs next year. None. There's no expectation the Detroit Red Wings will make the playoffs. Get better? Yes. And Steve Yzerman said he wants to see things get better. He doesn't want Detroit fans seeing another team that's going to get less than 20 wins. So good on Yzerman for doing his best to go through and do a proper rebuild. And we'll see how this goes for him going forward. But I don't think there's any pressure. I also don't think there's any pressure in Ottawa. Now, they're going to get better. Coming out of this year's draft, they have to. They have two likely top 5 draft picks. We don't know exactly who's drafting where yet. And now all that draft talk has kind of gone by the wayside, and so who knows what's going to happen, when they're going to have the draft. But the expectation on Ottawa isn't that high. It's really not that high. The expectation in Ottawa will very, very likely be, I'll say 75, 80 points would probably make people pretty happy. But again, that may change this summer if they decide to go out and spend money, which I don't think they will. Again, it's been a pretty methodical approach to just getting rid of everybody and bringing in as many prospects and draft picks as possible. Maybe they trade draft picks this year and try to get better in the offseason. But for right now, there isn't any pressure. And I have San Jose in this category as well because San Jose took that step back. They fall out of the playoffs this year. And in all likelihood, it's probably going to be a bit before they're back into contention, before they're back into a playoff spot. So for me, I have San Jose as a team that doesn't have any pressure on them. Now, could they get better with Couture being healthy and everybody else being healthy? Absolutely. Does that necessarily mean playoffs? Not necessarily. Now, in between, yay, it's hockey, and a playoff expectation, I have 2 teams in there. Anaheim. Anaheim, I think, will get better. I don't know that they necessarily make the playoffs next season, but they should get better. And there's a lot of good young players on the roster, and there's some good young ones coming in next year, too. Zegras really stands out as being perhaps that, future franchise guy for them. And we'll see what the draft does for them, as well as what it does for the Kings. Kings have one of the best prospect pools in the NHL. Easily one of the best prospect pools in the NHL. And so the expectation is going to be that they get better, there isn't necessarily going to be an expectation that necessarily leads to playoffs. It's about trending in the right direction. So at the time of the pause, the LA Kings were one of the hottest teams in the league. And justifiably, there was a lot of excitement around it, but I don't expect that to necessarily carry over into next year. So LA, of the three teams in California, I think is going to probably be the top of the three. Doesn't necessarily mean I see them in the playoffs. Now we're into the playoffs category, and here's what's interesting. I've got 6 teams. 6. Where I say, you know what, realistically, probably not expectations of playoffs. The other 25, I think you've got fan bases and media who may very well want playoffs, starting with Arizona. Arizona doesn't want to hear about how they're a good bunch that tries hard. They don't want to hear about how good their goaltending is, or how solid their defense is, or how tough they are. They want to hear about how much playoff tickets are going to be and how often they're going to be able to see playoffs going forward. This is a franchise that has struggled at the gate, and part of the reason is because they don't succeed on the ice. And so the expectation next year will be playoffs. There won't be excuses thrown around, I would think, because they're spending money now. Also, Buffalo, there has to be an expectation of playoffs for the Buffalo Sabres. Buffalo needs to make the playoffs. They desperately need to make the playoffs. And their fans, we're all Dwayne, right? That whole thing. The expectation is there that they'll make the playoffs. And I would be very surprised if they don't. Now, one of the ones I was kind of on the fence with, you'd know that if the audio had worked, but it didn't. So, what are you going to do? Minnesota. So, with Kaprizov coming in, there seems to be some expectation with Minnesota. At least he should be coming in. I'm pretty sure he hasn't signed a contract yet. Comment section hasn't been blown up by Minnesota fans yet. But the expectation, I think, is this team will get better. They had a pretty good run under Dean Evason. If Evason gets a shot at being the coach next year, there's no reason to think they won't be in the mix. And so playoffs are there. The one question I would have for Minnesota fans, and I had this last time too, do you want to see the team build towards the Stanley Cup? Do you want to see the team finish down in this region so that you have a better chance of getting those prospects to lead you to the Cup? Or do you believe that the best option is just to be competitive every year, take your best shot at it, and maybe risk further mediocrity? That's the question. Montreal is, I would think, playoff expectations next season. There has to be. This is a team that almost made the playoffs last year. Missed because it took a huge number of points to get in the East. If they'd been in the West, they would have made it. And this year they took the step back. So the expectation is going to be that they're going to get better. And we're going to see them in the playoffs next year. Going to be tremendous disappointment in Montreal fandom if they don't make the playoffs. So, yeah, Montreal's right there. Next up, New Jersey. New Jersey, they're tired of the rebuild as well. So you've got Arizona, Buffalo, and New Jersey where everybody's got to be sick of the rebuilding. And you want some playoffs. So the idea that New Jersey this summer could sell its fan base on, well, we're going to do a little bit of a retool in here, I don't think that's going to work. I understand that trading Taylor Hall meant they were giving up on this season, but if they give up on next season too, fans are going to be mad, and rightfully so. This is a fan base that's waited a while to get back into the playoffs and have some sort of prolonged success. So they get into the playoffs a couple years ago, go out in the first round, and since then it's been a mess. So the expectation, I think, will be that they'll get better. Rangers, I think there's expectation the Rangers make the playoffs. So again, these are teams that I don't think their fan base is going to be upset if they're out in the first round, but they'd like to see some playoff dates. The retool with the Rangers appears to be going very, very well. So with that retool apparently going very, very well, the expectation should be that the Rangers make their way into the playoffs. And again, not necessarily do a whole lot, but Shesterkin seems to have taken that fan base and ratcheted up their expectations just a little bit. Vancouver, Canuck fans will not accept falling back out of the playoffs. Canuck fans right now, with where Pettersson's been and Hughes and everybody else, and the fact we've now got these kids in the lineup and we've got a pretty good roster and Markstrom looked great, the expectation's going to be playoffs, and it won't change if Markstrom leaves. If Markstrom leaves as a UFA and they go with Demko and let's say Hudobin comes in as a backup, and you have Hudobin and Demko, fans are still going to want playoffs in Vancouver. That is not going to change. And Winnipeg. I think that with Winnipeg having some cap money that they can spend this coming summer, regardless of what happens with the salary cap, Winnipeg's going to be one of those teams that's in a better position than others. And so I think the expectation is going to be that we see Winnipeg back at least in the playoffs. At least in the playoffs. So this is your has to make the playoffs, doesn't necessarily have to win a round group. And then there's the have to win a round group. Starting with Calgary. The Flames, I don't think Flames fans would be happy next year if this team made the playoffs and didn't win a round. I think if they got knocked out in round one again, I think it would be pretty angering. I'm not saying that winning one round and being out in the next round would make them happy, but at least it would show some sort of upward momentum, and it would show some success for the Johnny Gaudreau-led team. And that would be probably to a benefit of the fan base and to the players, the roster. You have to wonder, with Giordano's career starts to wind down, who's going to take over for him on that blue line. Speaking of guys who played with Giordano, Dougie Hamilton as a healthy player. I think the expectation in Carolina would be at least to win a round. With Carolina, I could have thrown them down here as Cup, but I don't know that the expectations are that high with Carolina right now. But I will say if Carolina made the playoffs and lost in round one, I think that would be considered a disappointment. So I threw them into the win a round category. And I do think that that's right about where they belong. I also think Columbus belongs in the win a round category because Columbus, they want to show that what they did last year, where they finally won a round, wasn't just because they had Duchesne and Panarin and Bobrovsky, and that they can do it again with the blue-collar bunch they have now. So whether it happens this year or next year, and I'm thinking next year probably is more likely than this year, although with all the injuries that'll have healed up by now, who knows what Columbus might do if we get the playoffs done this summer. But the Blue Jackets, I think winning a round is important. I think if they go back to being an also-ran that makes the playoffs and goes out in the first round, that'll be disappointing to Columbus fans who really need to see a run out of this team. Florida desperately needs a run. There's no team that I think needs a run more in the playoffs than Florida. I know Toronto fans are going to be saying, are you sure? Yeah, actually, because Florida hasn't won a round since 96. So at least showing, hey, we made it to round two, we did it, yay, that would be something. That would be something that would show that this team isn't just going to continue to be mediocre for forever. I don't know how long this can go for. Islanders, I think it's important that they continue to show some steady progress. I think that the pressure to win it all will show up when they get in the new building. If they're still competitive once they get in the new building, I think the pressure will be there for them to maybe make it further than they have been for quite a while. Not being in the finals since 84 and all that. Not being in the conference finals since what? That was 93, I think, was the last time they made the conference final. So, yeah, I think the pressure, for next year would be just to kind of win around and hang around in there. And then I think the real pressure gets ratcheted up in the new building. St. Louis. So with the Blues, the trick with the Blues is they win the Stanley Cup last year. There's no pressure on them this year. Who cares, right? It's fine. They go out in the first round. It's fine. Although there were Blues fans that as we got closer to the pause started thinking, this back-to-back championship thing might be a lot of fun. Now, if they lose in the playoffs this year, I think the pressure for them to start winning again is there next year, because you don't want your team to look like a one and done. You don't want to be the next Calgary Flames that in 1989 won the Cup, and then they just didn't get close to it after that. And then you can kind of look at that and go, well, they got the one Cup, but they were kind of a fluke to get that. So you don't want to be the team that does that. And so I think for the Blues next year, I think at least winning a round, at least showing they were still in contention and a top 8 team in the league would be big. Now, in between win around and the finals, I didn't put up conference finals. I could have. I didn't. Even for the second take here, I didn't do it. But I have the Oilers as at least needing to win around. So they did it in 2017. They need to do it again. And I don't think that what happens in this year's playoffs, should we have playoffs this summer, I don't think that affects it. I think that the Oilers need to continue to show upward momentum. They were also rans for way too long. And it right now with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl playing as two of the best players in the NHL, they need to show something for that. And I think I could almost have argued them needing a finals appearance, but I'm not going that far yet because I don't know that pressure is on them as of yet. You guys can let me know what you think, though. Nashville. Nashville's important. Nashville gets to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2017 when it wasn't expected, and then 2018 they were one of the best teams in the league, and then they didn't manage to cash in the playoffs in 2018 or 2019, And this year and next year, I think whether it's this summer or next summer, that pressure is still going to be there. The expectation of something going in their favor. If they're going to win a Stanley Cup with Rinne, it either has to happen kind of this year or next year. And this year, of course, they're on the bubble as to whether or not they'd even make the playoffs. And so I think at least winning a round is on the menu. Although you could argue them as being on the cup side of the panic index. So Stanley Cup Finals. And notice I've already got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that the pressure would be to at least win a round. And I'm not done yet. So there's going to be a lot of disappointed fan bases. And if you're a general manager in the league that wants to argue that the playoffs need to be expanded, you could use this video. Just give me some credit on that. Colorado, I think a finals appearance is important. I think that for Colorado, I think they win a round last year. It's, of course, Colorado Avalanche and all that. This is a fashion jersey made by Starter that they never wore in a game. But I have honestly wanted them to wear this in a game for years. This color, I know they did this with other teams too. They did it with Philadelphia, Chicago. They did this color of a jersey. But with Colorado, it just pops. It just works. That would be so fantastic. Anyways, Colorado, I think a Stanley Cup Finals appearance would be, huge for them. And this is a team that, the fans have waited a long time to get back to the Stanley Cup. And it doesn't feel that long to somebody my age, but it has been. It's been about 20 years. So a finals appearance, considering everything that they've got going for them, McKinnon being in his prime, I think that's key. Dallas. Now, the ability of Dallas to get to a Stanley Cup Finals is going to depend on their goal scoring and definitely on a bounce back from Jamie Benn. I don't think Ben goes anywhere this summer. I don't think there's any chance of him getting traded. I don't think Dallas tries to trade him. Having Minnesota North Stars flashbacks. So I think for Dallas, they need to find their goal scoring to get there. But either way, I think there's pressure on them to do something more than just win a round. And go on a bit of a run. Because Dallas, much like Colorado, hasn't been Stanley Cup Finals relevant in a long time. 2000 was the last time we saw Dallas in the Stanley Cup Finals. Now, Pittsburgh, I have here as a finalist, although you could argue Pittsburgh for Stanley Cup, because Crosby, Malkin, and the boys are getting older, and so you kind of want to, have that last Stanley Cup for these guys before they retire. So I think a nice long run for them next year would be appropriate, and I don't think we should necessarily be surprised. And this is where it's funny, because remember, I did the video on my much too early predictions for where teams are going to finish in the playoffs, and I had Pittsburgh as rated as probably 7th in the division. But I'm saying that in a playoffs, that pressure is still going to be there. So while, yes, I could see the team regressing and falling out of the playoffs next year, I think the expectations are going to be high. Expectations are going to be high as long as Crosby's in Pittsburgh. Unless the whole team falls apart around him, it's going to be high. So, Stanley Cup. Boston. Boston needs to win one this year, next year. Now, if they win one this year, then Boston drops down to EA hockey territory, where Boston fans wouldn't really care what they did next year. But if they're going to win one, while Bergeron's around and other players are still at their peak or near it with Chara in their lineup, they kind of have to do it this year. And, of course, next year could be a challenge for them, because if Torrey Krug does move on, if they can't afford to keep him, and then if they do manage to find a way to keep him, but they have to move other players out and lose some depth that way, it could make it more of a challenge for them to get to it next year. But the pressure is still going to be on in Boston. Just arguing, well, they've been good for a long time. It doesn't matter. They won the Cup in 2011. That was the first time they'd won it since 1970. Being a good team, just being there and getting that participation ribbon just doesn't cut it. Philadelphia. Now, why is Philadelphia under Cup? Because Claude Giroux's getting to that stage. Jacob Voracek's getting to that stage where if you're going to get a Stanley Cup with them, you kind of got to do it now. And for Philadelphia, a team that hasn't won a Stanley Cup since the mid-'70s, for a city that could use another championship, the Flyers kind of sort of need to win one. Now, if you don't think Giroux winning a cup is all that important, the Flyers fall right down to win a round. If you're of the mind that this team's going to be really good for a long time anyways, so if Giroux doesn't win one, that's fine. They fall right down to win a round. So I could see the argument being made for each. Tampa. The expectation is going to be high in Tampa, and I don't think it matters who they have to get rid of this year to keep Sergachev. I think the expectations are going to remain sky high in Tampa Bay, and they've put together an excellent program. But much like Boston, being good every year doesn't matter if you don't win the championship. So Tampa Bay kind of needs to win one. Toronto. Now the pressure is going to be both fan-sided and on the media side. Now, I understand that there's a lot of expectations about their blue line not being good enough, and I'm not going to make the argument that it is, but there's still going to be cup pressure as long as Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Tavares are making the amount of money they're making. The cup pressure is going to be there. So when I point out that, yeah, they've lost in the first round, but which first round did they have home ice advantage in? And people say, oh, it doesn't matter. It does. Because it shows that the expectations in Toronto might be a little bit out of line, where they're expected to do something that maybe they haven't been in a position to have great success with, that they haven't really had that great season yet. But still, the expectations are going to be high. Vegas. Vegas gets kind of spoiled in the 2018 playoffs with the Stanley Cup Finals appearance in year 1. Year 2, we can all discuss what happened last year in the playoffs if we'd like. I'm not going to, but we know they didn't go to the finals last year. And the expectation is a Stanley Cup. Ownership's made it clear their expectations is Stanley Cup, and I think that it's understandable when you look at the record and when you look at the players they have and the amount of money they're spending on them. Yeah, you can throw Stanley Cup pressure on them. And I think if they went to the finals again and lost out of the Stanley Cup playoffs, I think that would be disappointment. So Washington is the last one on the board, meaning there are 6 teams that I'm looking at right now for next year. And again, this is far too early, but it's still fun to look at. And for me, Washington's a team that next year, that's going to be an issue where they don't want to be a one and done. They don't want to be a team that, oh, they made it. They won a Stanley Cup in 2018, but that was a fluke. They especially, worst case scenario would be next spring or this spring, they meet Pittsburgh in the playoffs and Pittsburgh knocks them out. That'd be a worst case scenario where it'd be like, oh, great. So that does make it look like it's a fluke. So the pressure is there for these 6 teams and these 3, and keep in mind those are 9 fan bases and media. They would likely be saying, a Stanley Cup Finals or a Stanley Cup would be nice. And only one team wins the Stanley Cup. Brian Burke always says, last I checked, there's only one Stanley Cup awarded every year. So unless something changes in 2021, which has been one of the many options that's been discussed about whether or not you could do multiple Stanley Cup winners next year, I don't know. We're in bizarre world, so who knows? But this is as best I could get it. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, where you as a fan fall on this panic index. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. Do hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I'll definitely check the audio on this one before I upload it. It's just weird because, like I said, the audio is fine on the first 3 videos I do. I do a 4th video and it's just complete crap. I don't know. Anyways, thank you guys so much for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.